In the first 9 months of 1847, while 400,000 Irish men, women and children died of starvation and famine-related disease, 822,681 gallons of butter were shipped from Ireland to England. Not from some distant colony, not from a conquered territory overseas, from Ireland, a country that was, according to its own governing authority, an integral part of the United Kingdom. And the butter was only the beginning. To understand how a country can starve while its own ports overflow with food, you have to understand what Ireland was in the 1840s. Not what the maps said it was. The maps said it was part of Britain, united under the Act of Union of 1800, represented in the Parliament at Westminster. What Ireland actually was, in economic terms, was something closer to a plantation. By the middle of the 19th century, roughly 75% of Irish agricultural land was devoted not to feeding the people who lived on it, but to producing wheat, oats, barley, and livestock for export. The land was owned, overwhelmingly, by a class of Anglo-Irish landlords, many of whom had never set foot on their Irish estates. They lived in London, or Bath, or the English countryside, and they collected rents from tenant farmers who subdivided their holdings into smaller and smaller plots, subletting to labourers who had no security of tenure and no legal protection against eviction. The people at the bottom of this system, the courtiers, the landless labourers, the families crammed onto half-acre plots, survived almost exclusively on one crop, the potato. It was the only food that could produce enough calories on a small enough piece of land to keep a family alive. A single acre of potatoes could feed a family of 6 for a year. No grain crop came close. And so by 1845, more than 3 million Irish people ate virtually nothing else. Not because they were ignorant, not because they lacked ambition, because the economic structure of colonial Ireland had left them no alternative. The grain, the cattle, the butter, the oats, those belonged to the landlord. Those were the rent. Those went to market. The potato was what was left. When the fungus Phytophthora infestans arrived in the autumn of 1845 and destroyed roughly 1/3 of the potato crop, the question was immediate and obvious. Ireland was still producing enormous quantities of food. The potato had failed, but the wheat had not. The oats had not. The cattle were healthy. The butter was being churned. The question was whether any of that food, the food being grown on Irish soil by Irish labour, would be redirected to feed the Irish people who were now facing starvation. The answer came from London. And the answer was no. The economic doctrine that governed British policy in the 1840s was laissez-faire, the belief that markets must be allowed to operate without government interference, that supply and demand would naturally correct any imbalance, and that state intervention in the economy would cause more harm than good. This was not a fringe theory. It was the governing philosophy of the Whig administration under Prime Minister Lord John Russell, and it was enforced with particular zeal by one man, Sir Charles Trevelyan, the Assistant Secretary to the Treasury and the official in charge of famine relief in Ireland. Trevelyan was not a monster in the way popular imagination sometimes portrays him. He worked extraordinarily long hours. He organized the importation of Indian corn from America. He oversaw the creation of public works programs and later soup kitchens that at their peak fed 3 million people daily. But Trevelyan operated within an ideological framework that placed the sanctity of the free market above the survival of the people the market was supposed to serve. And nowhere was this more visible, more documented, more quantified, more damning than in the matter of food exports. According to the research of Professor Christine Kinealy, published in History Ireland magazine in 1997, almost 4,000 vessels carried food from Ireland to the ports of Bristol, Glasgow, Liverpool and London during 1847 alone. That is roughly 11 ships per day, every single day, for an entire year. And these were not ships slipping quietly out of Dublin harbour in the dead of night. The food was transported openly, overland, through the most famine-devastated regions of the country, to ports that the starving could see from their roads and their fields. The shipping records have survived. The cargo manifests have survived. The names of the ports, the dates, the quantities, all of it is in the archive. The ports from which this food departed read like a map of the famine's worst killing grounds: Ballina, Ballyshannon, Bantry, Dingle, Killala, Kilrush, Limerick, Sligo, Tralee, Westport. These were not prosperous trading centres untouched by hunger. These were the epicentres of mass death. Kilrush in County Clare would lose nearly a quarter of its population. Westport in County Mayo was surrounded by townlands where entire families were found dead in their cabins. Sligo's workhouse was so overwhelmed that bodies were buried in mass graves without coffins. And from these ports, day after day, the food sailed out. The scale of what left Ireland in 1847 is not a matter of estimate or approximation. It is a matter of customs records. Cormac O'Grada, professor of economics at University College Dublin, documented that in 1845, the first year of the Blight, 3,251,907 quarters of corn were exported from Ireland to Britain. A quarter is 8 bushels. That same year, 257,257 sheep crossed the Irish Sea to British markets. In 1846, the second year of the Blight, 480,827 pigs were exported. 186,483 oxen followed them. But it was 1847, Black 47, the year the death toll reached its catastrophic peak that produced the most staggering figures. According to Kinealy's analysis of the shipping returns, 9,992 calves were exported from Ireland to Britain that year. This was not a decline from previous years, it was a 33% increase. In the 12 months following the second catastrophic failure of the potato crop, 4,000 horses and ponies were shipped to England. The export of bacon and ham rose. The export of livestock to Britain, with the sole exception of pigs, increased during the famine years. In total, between 1846 and 1850, over 3 million live animals were exported from Ireland, more than the number of human beings who emigrated during the same period. The butter figures are perhaps the most viscerally shocking. Butter was shipped in wooden containers called firkins, each holding 9 gallons. In the first 9 months of 1847, 56,557 firkins of butter were exported from Ireland to Bristol alone. Another 34,852 firkins went to Liverpool. Combined, that is 822,681 gallons of butter, shipped to England from Ireland in the 9 worst months of the worst year of the famine. If the final 3 months of that year were even remotely comparable, the total exceeds 1 million gallons. And it was not just grain and livestock and butter. The customs records show that a vast and almost absurd variety of food left Ireland during 1847. Peas, beans, onions, rabbits, salmon, oysters, herring, lard, honey, eggs. In February 1847, 377 boxes of fish and eggs and 383 boxes of fish were imported into Bristol in a single shipment from Ireland. The Irish Sea was a conveyor belt of calories, flowing steadily eastward, while the people who had produced those calories collapsed in ditches and on the sides of roads. The alcohol figures add another dimension. During the first 9 months of 1847, grain-derived alcohol exports from Ireland to England included 874,170 gallons of porter, 278,658 gallons of Guinness. and 183,392 gallons of whiskey. The grain that was distilled into those beverages, the barley, the oats, the wheat, could have been milled into flour and baked into bread. It was instead fermented, distilled, bottled, and shipped across the Irish Sea to be consumed in English pubs, while Irish children died with grass stains around their mouths from trying to eat the fields. Now, a crucial historical nuance must be acknowledged here, because the story of food exports during the famine is more complex than a simple narrative of theft allows. Some historians, most notably Austin Bourke, have argued that by 1847, grain imports into Ireland actually exceeded grain exports, particularly after the repeal of the Corn Laws in June 1846 opened British ports to cheaper foreign grain. The British government did import Indian corn and maize, particularly under Peel's earlier administration. And the wheat Ireland exported was largely winter wheat, used for animal feed, while the wheat it imported was spring wheat, used for bread. But this argument, while statistically defensible in narrow terms, misses the fundamental point that Kinealy and Woodham Smith and O'Grada have all identified. The question is not whether the precise tonnage of exports exceeded the precise tonnage of imports in every single month of the famine. The question is whether a government that controlled the ports, commanded the military, and had the legal authority to redirect food chose to let that food leave a starving country. And the answer, documented in Trevelyan's own correspondence, is unambiguous. In the summer of 1846, Commissary General Sir Randolph Ruth, Trevelyan's own man on the ground in Ireland, urged that the ports be closed to prevent grain exports. Ruth was not a radical. He was not an Irish nationalist. He was a British military officer and civil servant who had been sent to Ireland to manage famine relief, and what he saw convinced him that the continued export of food from a country in the grip of mass starvation was indefensible. He wrote to Trevelyan, requesting authorization to close the ports. Trevelyan's reply is preserved in the official correspondence. It is one of the most consequential sentences in Irish history. He wrote back, "Do not encourage the idea of prohibiting exports. Perfect free trade is the right course." Ruth did not accept this. He pressed again, insisting that closing the ports was essential to prevent further catastrophe. Trevelyan refused again. The ports remained open, the ships continued to sail, and the dying continued. What makes Trevelyan's refusal not merely callous, but historically damning, is that there was a precedent, a clear, documented, successful precedent for exactly what Ruth was proposing, and Trevelyan knew it existed. In 1782, Ireland had experienced a severe food shortage, not on the scale of what was coming in the 1840s, but serious enough to threaten widespread hunger. The response of the government at that time was immediate and pragmatic. The ports were closed. An embargo was placed on the export of foodstuffs from the country. The result was exactly what anyone with a basic understanding of supply and demand would predict. Food that had been destined for export remained in Ireland, supply increased relative to demand, and food prices dropped sharply. The merchants protested. They lobbied against the embargo. They argued that their commercial interests were being violated. The government overrode them. The crisis was contained. The years 1782 to 1784 are barely remembered as years of distress in Irish history, precisely because the intervention worked. This is the fact that transforms the story of food exports during the Great Famine from a tragedy into something harder to name. It was not that the British government of the 1840s faced an unprecedented situation with no precedent for action. It was not that they lacked a model for intervention. It was not that closing the ports was an untested, radical, unpredictable measure. It had been done before, in Ireland, by a British government, within living memory, and it had worked. The crisis of 1782 had been averted by precisely the action that Ruth was begging Trevelyan to take in 1846. Trevelyan said no, not because he didn't know it would work, because his ideology told him the market must not be disturbed. The food did not simply walk itself to the docks, it was escorted. British military regiments guarded the convoys of grain and livestock as they moved through the Irish countryside to the ports. They guarded the ports themselves. They guarded the warehouses where food was stored awaiting shipment. The Pictorial Times of London published an illustration on October 30th, 1847. It is preserved in the Guildhall Library, showing food supplies being transported under military escort through the Irish countryside. This was not a secret operation. It was an open, visible, daily reality. Soldiers with rifles walking alongside carts of oats and barrels of butter through counties where the roadsides were lined with the emaciated and the dead. The Irish people who witnessed this were not passive. There were food riots. There were attempts to seize cargo. In several counties, crowds tried to block the movement of food convoys to the ports. The response was suppression. The military escorts existed precisely because the government anticipated, correctly, that starving people would attempt to take the food that was being shipped past them. The solution was not to redirect the food. The solution was to ensure the food reached the ships. Cecil Woodham Smith, whose 1962 book, The Great Hunger, remains one of the most authoritative accounts of the famine, wrote that no issue provoked so much anger or so embittered relations between England and Ireland as what she called the indisputable fact that huge quantities of food were exported from Ireland to England throughout the period when the people of Ireland were dying of starvation. She chose the word indisputable deliberately. The customs records are in the archive. The shipping manifests survive. The correspondence between Trevelyan and Ruth is a matter of public record. The parliamentary papers are catalogued in the British Library. There is no factual dispute about whether the food left. The only dispute is about what it means. John Mitchell, the Irish nationalist and contemporary witness, put it in terms that have echoed through 170 years of Irish memory. He wrote that a ship sailing into an Irish port during the famine years with a cargo of grain was sure to meet 6 ships sailing out with a similar cargo. Mitchell was a polemicist, not a statistician, and his numbers were impressionistic rather than precise. But the underlying observation, that Ireland was simultaneously importing relief and exporting abundance, has been confirmed by every serious historian who has examined the customs data. What the export figures reveal is not simply a failure of policy. They reveal the architecture of a colonial economy in its most naked form. Ireland produced food. That food belonged legally to the landlords who owned the land. The landlords needed the income from exports to pay their own debts, maintain their English estates, and fund their lifestyles. The tenants who actually grew the food had no legal claim to it. They paid their rent in labor and in kind, and what they received in return was the right to cultivate a small plot of potatoes for their own subsistence. When the potatoes died, the tenants had nothing, but the landlords still had their grain, their cattle, their butter. And the market in England still wanted to buy it. The British government could have intervened. It could have closed the ports, as it had in 1782. It could have purchased Irish grain for redistribution, as Peel had done with American corn in 1845. It could have imposed export duties to make foreign sale less profitable than domestic distribution. It could have requisitioned food stores in the most affected districts. Instead, it chose to protect the property rights of landlords and the principles of free trade. Trevelyan wrote in a private letter to Edward Twistleton, one of the Poor Law Commissioners in Ireland, a sentence that reveals the ideological framework with chilling clarity. He wrote, "We must not complain of what we really want to obtain. If small farmers go, and their landlords are reduced to sell portions of their estates to persons who will invest capital, we shall at last arrive at something like a satisfactory settlement of the country. The famine, in Trevelyan's own words, was not merely a crisis to be managed. It was an opportunity. The mass death and mass emigration of the Irish poor would clear the land of the smallholders and cottiers whose very existence offended the principles of efficient, capitalist agriculture. The food exports were not an unfortunate side effect of a natural disaster. They were the mechanism by which the colonial economy continued to function, continued to profit, while the people who sustained it were eliminated. The numbers bear this out in the long term. Ireland's population stood at approximately 8.4 million in the census of 1841. By 1851, it had fallen to 6.6 million. 1 million dead, over 1 million emigrated. And the consolidation of land that Trevelyan envisioned did occur. Farms were merged, small holdings cleared, and the proportion of land devoted to cattle grazing increased dramatically after the famine. More land than before was used for producing animal foods for export to Britain. The ships that had carried food out of a starving country during the famine continued to carry food out of a depopulated country after it. There is a particular detail in Kinealy's research that deserves to be isolated and contemplated. She notes that the food shipped from Ireland in 1847 departed from the most famine-stricken parts of the country, not from the relatively prosperous east, not from the anglicised Pale around Dublin, from Bantry, where the bodies were found in cabins with no one left alive to bury them, from Kilrush, where Captain Arthur Kennedy, the poor law inspector, reported that he could not keep count of the dead, from Westport, where the local relief committee wrote to Dublin that they had exhausted every resource and could offer nothing more to the dying. From these places, these specific named documented killing fields, the butter and the grain and the cattle walked past the corpses and onto the ships. The contemporary newspaper accounts confirm what the customs data describes. The Illustrated London News, which sent artists to Ireland to document the famine, published images of skeletal figures in rags alongside reports of thriving agricultural exports. The Cork Examiner recorded the daily arrivals and departures of cargo ships in its shipping columns, the same pages that carried notices of mass evictions and workhouse deaths. The duality was not hidden. It was published. It was visible to anyone who could read a newspaper. And still, the ships sailed. Trevelyan was knighted for his services in 1848. He received the Knight Commander of the Order of the Bath, one of the highest honours the British Crown could bestow on a civil servant. His own account of the famine relief programme, published that same year under the title The Irish Crisis, presented his management of the catastrophe as a qualified success. He acknowledged the suffering. He expressed sympathy. But he maintained that the policies he had implemented, including the refusal to close the ports, had been fundamentally correct. The market had functioned. Property had been protected. The natural course of events had been allowed to proceed. The cost of that natural course was measured not in trade balances or export figures, but in mass graves. In Skibbereen, in County Cork, the dead were buried in pits behind the workhouse. Some estimates suggest over 8,000 bodies in a space smaller than a football pitch. In Kilkenny, the famine burial ground on John's Hill contains the remains of thousands. In Abistrury, the churchyard was so full that coffins were stacked 3 deep. And through all of this, through every month of mass death, through every season of desperate hunger, the ships kept leaving. 11 per day, 4,000 in a year. Loaded with food, grown on Irish land by Irish hands, escorted by British soldiers past Irish dead, bound for English tables. The question of whether the Great Famine constitutes genocide remains debated among historians, and this is not the place to resolve that debate. What is not debated, what the customs records and the shipping manifests and the parliamentary correspondence make categorically clear, is that the mass death in Ireland between 1845 and 1852 occurred not because there was no food, but because the food was allowed to leave. The mechanism was the market. The enforcer was the military. The justification was an ideology. And the precedent that proved the alternative was known and effective, the closure of ports in 1782, which had worked, which had saved lives, which was within living memory, was deliberately, consciously, and documentedly rejected. Cecil Woodham Smith was right. No issue has provoked so much anger, because the food left Ireland under guard, in plain sight, past the dying, across a sea that was 12 hours wide, to a country that did not need it as desperately as the country it came from. And the record survived. Every firkin of butter, every calf, every barrel of oats, every gallon of whiskey, every ship, every port, every date. 822,681 gallons of butter in 9 months. That number is not an accusation. It is a customs entry, and customs entries do not exaggerate.